Good afternoon. Welcome to another video. After the last one on William R. Kennedy, who had hung himself. Um, it, it was a big question, and I kept needing to feel like I needed to research the area more. And it is an area that, personally I had spent time at, and in my mind, I knew exactly where I went and got my egg McMuffin before we went through the town, or where we bought a beach ball, or, it was definitely a place that, as I was growing up, we always would drive through that area. And it was pretty obvious when I went through the area that there was, logging business still going on. And a lot of it, you get used to smells, especially of certain industries. And so there was that aspect of it. But William was not, I think he was very young. And as I explained earlier in the other video, um, it was strange to me because a year before he hung himself, he'd actually been traveling all over the world. He'd went to Japan and Hong Kong and Malaysia and all of the Philippine Islands, up into Canada. One of the things I found that I really wanted to share with you, and it was, I actually, I found it, but it referred to him as being a log seller. And in my mind, I had thought about that a lot, and what would a log person, log seller do? So I'm looking at the possibility, and I think the directions of most of the information that have been able to look up, that there were people named that they were log sellers, and that they would go out and they'd negotiate with where the logs were and where there was an excess of logs available, and then they would go out into these places. Now, I never thought about them necessarily going all those places around the world, but I do remember when I was in Hong Kong, several years ago, but I saw logs that were coming from Weyerhaeuser, and I worked in Weyerhaeuser, and it was the largest mill for many, many years in my hometown. So, I really grew up with some of it. So some of it I think I just took for granted. I mean, when I was working there, I could look out the window and see the big ships coming in, from across the sea. And um, they would, load up and then take back off and go down the Columbia River and take the logs with them. And sometimes they took them in different, um, as whatever they needed them for. Now, a lot of the logs that I saw when I was in Hong Kong actually was taken off the ships, and then they were put back in the water and bound them, so they looked very much how they were when they came out of the woods, up close to even where I grew up as a child. There was a logging bridge that went across the Cowlitz River that only hauled the logs out of the woods. And so, there, when you grow up with, and we didn't travel a lot, we would go up into that area and camp a lot near the ocean. But, as far as really um, going places and seeing it, you just take for granted that that's what it is. So there was several different things that I came up with first. I actually even, I use Ancestry.com pretty exclusively. I've been able to, I haven't run out of information from them, and so I find that the information they have available, and they've added some new things right now that is AI, artificial intelligence. And so sometimes you can click on, like Gray's Harbor. Um, if I click on Gray's Harbor in Washington, they would come up with a bunch of information about, when it was established and what it was like and everything. Now, I've been experimenting with the AI, and I find it really intriguing, but at the same time, a lot of times you have to go 3 or 4 distances and keep asking questions before you get what you need. And I wasn't really interested in most of the general information because I was really trying to hone in on what it was like when the Kennedy boys and the Kennedy sons were in and out of that area, and their families were in and out of that area even after their parents had died. So, so I did I did a lot of different kind of uh, Googling type research, but even some different things that I would come across, then I became very interested in it. One of the things, though, is I had a professor in social history at the University of New Mexico, and I'll always remember this. And I love movies anyway, but he said, if you do nothing else in your life, see every movie that comes out, because what you're going to be seeing is you're going to be seeing like what what did people wear back then? What did they what were their lives like? And there was this whole um, bunch of reality things that really would come out of the movies. And that evening after I'd finished with that video, I was watching a movie, and it actually ended up being, yeah, and it was kind of a action thriller in a way, and it was in a sawmill environment. And then I started remembering back to my childhood and just some of the stories I heard growing up near a logging town, the gruffness, the a lot of people were very angry at life, it seemed like. And for instance, I can remember when I was working on the mill site, um, and and back then it was always interesting too, is the workers, all the loggers would, well, a lot of the loggers would go directly into the forest and start cutting down trees, but a lot of them would come down to the mill, and they were processing all this, whether it was sawing up the logs or paper or plywood or whatever they were going to make, use this and then sell what they had, the product. But there would be a horn, and you could hear it all over town when it was time to be to work. And then when work was done, it went out again, this big loud noise. And it was really interesting. Now when I go up to visit, or even when I lived up there a little bit when my mom was still alive, you can't tell, you can't tell that everybody there worked at the mills, because they don't. And but back then it was very much that was it. I mean, if you're going to work in that area, you're going to be working somehow in the logging industry. Another thing that I did look into a little bit. Now, most of these people that I'm dealing with in the genealogy right now are people who actually came down from Canada, and they went into Michigan, and then from Michigan, especially around Alpena, and a lot of them stayed in Alpena, and I've been able to track their lives. But then there was this group that ended up out in Washington, and when I read about Alpena and what was available for their jobs and what people were doing, it was very, very similar to the same type of work that was available. However, just recently I was reading more about some of the situations where, um, like in Alpena, I mean, like once they chop down the trees, if that's, it's if they're not continually planting new trees, which Weyerhaeuser always did, and I think a lot of the big mills, oh, will sneeze. But and so even as when I can remember being in school, I think about in junior high, and they took us out to the and gave us all this stuff about conservation and all the replanting of the trees, and it was very interesting. And then they gave us this little tree to take home with us. Um, and my sister actually had gotten a tree also, and I don't know if it was hers or mine. I think for some reason it was hers, and they even named it. I think they named it Daryl, and it was in the backyard. Well, this was, over the years it did grow like, and it was always remembering back to, you know, even like my dad worked at the post office, but they had to have postal people, they had to have the police, they had to have the fire truck. There's all these other professions, but basically everything catered to the business. And and then as it grew, it was mainly lumber, but then it grew into um, other mills that was along the Columbia River because it was very convenient for them to come into the dock. They come into Columbia River and go and then dock in these areas and load up with whatever. And some of it was the paper, or some of it was aluminum. There was a large aluminum mill there, smelting unit, and so that was, going back to that. And in that movie is when I really started realizing that that's what I saw a lot of times in my life was because it rains a lot up there, so there's always a lot of mud, a lot of and there's always this smell. And I'm not talking about the processing smell that I've mentioned before about how they think it smells like money, but it's probably, you know, you have to breathe it all the time too. And that's different. But in these sawmills, it was like wet sawdust in a way. And then these mud, and it was this fascinating because this movie was just totally, giving me the memories of when I was young, and how much of the time we would go down to the Columbia River and watch the ships go by, or be fishing, but also being at these sawmills and even working there. In the first job, that when you get hired at Weyerhaeuser, you were supposed to always be on the mail run, and I had tested out supposedly, higher than that. And so I didn't have to do the mail run, but there were times when I had to go out into the mill and go through, it's all these smells. I mean, I don't know if you, it's just, I think it's really just the smell of wet, muddy, um, oh, pieces of, you know, parts of trees, not like sawdust. They cut and the sawdust. And but anyway, so the other thing in this movie though that got me going, that I really started remembering more about, was the battle about the Union. And growing up with that, I mean, I heard the terminology like, either you belong to the union, or you were called a scab if you worked someplace that wasn't union. And I know people right now that will not shop someplace that aren't paying union prices, even for just regular grocery stores. There's some of them up there that are not union, and the union people will not go to a store. And I can remember then when they would um, strike, there would be strikes where the union would negotiate and they wanted more money. And it's a whole nother topic really, in a way, just how the union affected not only the lumber companies but also like manufacturing of cars. And there was a good part to unions, I think, in the beginning, um, to take care of, like when they would negotiate for some kind of health care for their workers, or um, some special benefits that were really needed, like working too many hours, or the wages, or whatever they would strike for. But now sometimes it gets pretty in details that I don't know. When I in my last job, um there was a union for some of the people um that worked in the offices and everything. And just listening to some of the things, as like a manager, you would have to make sure everything was all your you had to be really careful, or you would be confronted with the unions. But the unions up here now, where the Kennedys were doing all their wheeling and dealings with these logs, um, was not real established. But it was also this Grays Harbor was one of the largest harbors, evidently in the world. Even it was so big, and in its heyday, I don't know that where it is right now, but in its heyday, people were coming in just to go to out there to work. People from Ireland, or people that Scotland, people that, like, there was Germans and people that knew they could work because they knew that trade, and so they would go out there. So, and there was just the big ships would come in, and there was a lot of sailors in and out of that area. And I ran across this one story, and his name was William, of course. um, Goal, Goal. It was Gohl, and they called him Billy. And he was a man who, I think he started out. He came into the United States because he wanted to be able to find gold. And so he went down there and he didn't find gold. And so then he decided this other business would be, possibly better for him. So he went up there, and he was like the labor, he worked for the union. And so he was around all these sailors coming and going and asking questions, and the ones that were union, and or persuading them to join the union. And anyway, he became um, one of the worst serial killers in the state of Washington, probably ever. And it was, he would get these people into this, it was a nice union building. They would come in, and they were looking to where their mail was, or had these different questions. But then he would ask them questions unbeknownst, to them, that he was trying to figure out how much money that he had on himself. Did he have relatives living in that area that would miss him? And so then he started picking these people off and murdering them, and then throwing them into the river. And he went on for many, many years before they were able to actually finally, put two and two together, and realize that he was this serial killer that they had been, because they were finding bodies. And but then he was put into an insane asylum for, more like the criminal type people, and he was really mentally ill. But what came to mind was the, when you have those situations where people are, where especially where money, their livelihood, whether they've how far they've traveled to even find this other kind of work, or want to be able to improve their life, that you're going to get this influx of people. And there were people just coming and going around to those different ports as this proceeded. So I think in my mind, I mean, I know that most of you know now, because I've shared enough about my upbringing. But growing up in a logging town, when I was 21, I moved to San Francisco by myself. And it was quite an adventure, but it was, there was just so much cement and so many buildings, and so kind of clean and orderly in some ways from where I grew up. And so even when I go back and I start reminiscing about some of these experiences as a child or as a teenager, or, you know, that I experienced firsthand, especially the thing with, even so, sometimes a Chinese ship would come into the dock, and all these people that were the sailors got off the ship, and then they would walk, oh, I don't know, a mile and a half, to a Chinese restaurant and eat food. And then they'd hike back to their port. And but we didn't really understand. I don't think I for sure understood exactly how come they were coming, and how come they were filling up these, ships with the logs and taking them where they wanted them, because they didn't have trees. And but there was almost this level of, it wasn't totally fear or paranoia, but I think that our parents probably was a little bit concerned sometimes when the ships, big ships would come in. There could be, these are the great big ships, not, well, I say that, but sometimes in movies I see there's much bigger, especially container ships and stuff, but there were big ships would come in and then all these foreigners would be walking around our city, and then walk back down to their ship. So I think there was some understanding or misunderstanding that these people might be dangerous to us. And so there was a part of it that and I remember hearing lots of jokes that, you know, in logging town, it's a different world. And so I can remember, hearing a lot of comments about it. Now, I can't say, going back to, why this man hung himself, but I began to kind of see, like, in my mind, because I've been in so many big cities, and I retired out of Portland, Oregon. I lived in San Francisco. I've been lived in Austin. I've lived in Portland. So I'm used to that now. But when you get back to thinking about, especially when the union's involved, and there was definitely some big shots, big shots. There was one man, I'm trying to think what his name was. He came in and he opened a lumber company in that area, and became very wealthy. And so some of the pictures were these beautiful homes, but most of it was more like what I was talking about, the sawdust and the mud and and the boots and the way loggers dress, and they're everywhere. I mean, even I know people that, were my age when they were still working in the woods, and, you know, they they knew all the saws and all I mean, even on 4th of July, we'd always have this big celebration where they would, how fast can you cut the log down, or can you walk on it and spin it? And, I mean, and it's interesting because when you take it a little bit for granted when you grow up with a situation like that. So it's been fun for me to do this much diving into this particular area. And I have to say, most of the time when I've talked about the mills and people working at the mills, there's a lot of high risk um, accidents that can happen, and it's the same way in the woods. I think that there's, when you get hurt in the woods, you're hurt pretty bad, and so when people, that's their livelihood. I mean, I saw people, that just had lost their leg or lost their arm, or something got caught in a chainsaw, or it was very dangerous. But you kind of couple that then with this whole other frenzy of all these people coming from all over the world and sailing in and sailing out, and the yeah, I mean, and a lot of them are kind of wild Willie West people. And sometimes I think about that, or the people who wouldn't want to come out and visit my sweet grandma because the brothers and sisters were afraid of the Indians. Well, I mean, when you grow up in that situation, you don't think like that, but it is. So I think this whole story for me about this man and the situation and why this happened to him, I mean, I don't know that I'll ever find out unless somebody, I keep contacting people that are also related into this area around there. And, somebody might come to me and say, oh yeah, this is what happened, because there's so many reasons that, but even sometimes hangings can be not hangings like hang yourself. Somebody could have hung him. No, I don't mean to get too gruesome, but it is a possibility. And when I'm doing the genealogy, sometimes uh, I have to remember that it's not just the people that the people who are maybe doing the trying to find this information may be more educated and not wanted by the law or something like that. But at the same time, you got to be prepared for what. what's going to show up. And there was one other part of this that, and I had mentioned Vernita a couple times in that last video, and I wanted to share this, and I kind of was working on it today, and I think well, it's an interesting story if it's not even somebody that is DNA matched. Um, I think that I find more and more how much I enjoy the stories of these people and their lives. But now Vernita actually had two husbands, and one of the husbands, and I can't tell for sure. I usually can always tell whether she would be the mother or whether this dude might have been married before and had kids. But there was one of their sons, and it's listed on a census report that he was a child of Vernita and this man. And then when I read his death certificate, I got really kind of confused about it because it talked about it looked like he worked for the railroad. And that's what I would say. I would say, yeah, this dude worked for the railroad. However, when it got down to the detail of it, oh, and it said it gave a whole bunch of a list of different problems that he experienced, but then it also said that he had epileptic seizures sometimes, and but then you couldn't tell for sure. They usually put it primary, secondary, tertiary as far as which one, so you kind of know that maybe some of this other stuff that up above the seizures could have happened. But anyway, so it's it said on the death certificate the name of the hospital in which this accident happened, and it mentioned the railroad. And so the more I dug around and trying to figure out where the doctor had to go to pronounce him dead, um, and so he must have died on the train, and then they pronounced him dead, and then they took him off the train. So I don't know. It might be just I think that I like history so much, and I like the unknowing. I do watch some like more the crimes that are happening right now, but I think that because of my interest in history and how much I find this intriguing, and I don't know what the next surprise is going to be, but I did want to get back to you about Mr. Kennedy and the hanging part of it. And I don't know what I'll come up with next, but bye bye.